How far would you go to stop a predator when the law turns a blind eye? Would you risk everything? Your career, your freedom, your soul to take down a monster? On a sweltering August night in 2022, the air inside the Birmingham, Alabama police precinct felt heavier than usual. The hum of fluorescent lights buzzed faintly above the quiet chaos of paperwork, ringing phones, and the muffled voices of officers on duty. Beneath the surface, an invisible tension crackled like a storm waiting to break. At her desk in the corner, Officer Jane Doe sat rigidly, her fingers nervously tracing the edges of a case file. A decorated officer with a spotless record, Jane was the kind of cop you'd expect to see lauded in press conferences and training manuals, a symbol of dedication and resilience. But tonight, her usual composure wavered. She wasn't just grappling with the pressures of the job. Behind her stoic expression lay an internal battle no one could see. The precinct, for all its camaraderie and teamwork, had become a battleground for Jane, a place where her integrity and sanity were tested daily. Shadows loomed over her career, and they weren't just from the criminal underworld she'd vowed to fight. Her professional life was a facade, masking the relentless harassment and humiliation she endured from someone who was supposed to lead her. That someone was Captain John Smith. The man who towered above the precinct's hierarchy had slowly morphed into her personal nightmare. His presence in the room sent a chill through her despite the stifling heat. Every glance, every word, every lingering pause in conversation, John wielded his authority like a weapon, cutting her down with threats disguised as commands and smirks cloaked in false friendliness. Jane's nights were sleepless, haunted by his leering gaze and the unspeakable things he implied behind closed doors. But tonight was different. This wasn't just another long shift. Jane's heart pounded in her chest, her pulse quickening as thoughts she had tried to suppress for weeks finally broke free. The rage she had bottled up, the fear she had swallowed, it all threatened to boil over. She clenched her fists under the desk, her nails digging into her palms as she replayed the events that had brought her to this breaking point. John thought he was untouchable. His rank, his power, his unchecked arrogance, it all made him believe he could take what he wanted, do what he pleased without consequences. But Jane knew something he didn't. She had a secret, a truth so personal and painful that she had buried it deep, hoping it would never see the light of day. Yet now, that secret felt like the only weapon she had left. The precinct walls seemed to close in as the clock ticked toward midnight. Outside, the city hummed with life, but inside, Jane felt utterly alone. Her breaths came shallow, her mind racing as she considered the unthinkable. She knew this night would change everything, not just for her, but for him, for the department, and perhaps even for the city she had sworn to protect. The storm inside her had been brewing for years, but tonight it would finally break. For years, Jane had been the department's golden officer. She had solved cases that others had deemed impossible, earned the respect of her peers, and even inspired the next generation of recruits. But her rise to the top came with a shadow named Captain John Smith. It had started subtly, almost imperceptibly, a comment here, a lingering glance there. At first, Jane dismissed it as a misunderstanding or her own overactive perception. After all, John was a commanding officer, a decorated leader with decades in the force. Surely he meant no harm, but the comments became sharper, the glances more deliberate. His casual jokes about her appearance turned into suggestive remarks. Compliments gave way to questions about her personal life. Questions he had no business asking. By the time she realized what was happening, she was already trapped in his web. John's harassment grew bolder, more insidious. When she rebuffed his advances, he retaliated in ways that only someone in his position could. He reassigned her from high-profile cases to trivial assignments, blocked her promotions, and sowed doubts about her capabilities among their colleagues. Every time she walked into the precinct, she felt eyes on her, whispers trailing behind her like a sinister echo. Was it pity? Judgment? She couldn't tell anymore. And then came the threats. "Careful, Officer Doe," John had once whispered to her in the hallway, his voice low and menacing. "You wouldn't want to end up on the wrong side of an internal investigation. I'd hate to see your spotless record tarnished." It was a knife to her spirit, a cruel reminder of the power he wielded. Jane felt as though she were suffocating, gasping for air in an environment that offered none. Reporting him wasn't an option, at least not one that seemed feasible. Who would believe her? John was untouchable, his reputation immaculate. He had friends in high places, allies who would protect him at all costs. And her? She was just an officer, one voice in a sea of silence. Yet she wasn't powerless, not entirely. In the depths of her despair, Jane began to document everything. Every inappropriate comment, every veiled threat, every abuse of authority. She wrote it all down, methodically, like piecing together evidence for a case. She studied John's patterns, his vulnerabilities. Over time, she realized something crucial. Even the untouchable have weaknesses. Her documentation grew into a weapon, a lifeline. She knew she couldn't win a head-on battle against John, not yet, but she could prepare, and tonight, after months of planning and agonizing over the risks, she was ready to take her first step toward reclaiming her life. As the precinct buzzed around her, Jane stared at the envelope on her desk. Inside was a copy of her findings, a dossier detailing years of harassment and corruption. She had sent the original to someone outside the department, someone she trusted. But this envelope wasn't for the higher-ups or the internal affairs division. This was for John. A calculated risk. She knew what she was doing was dangerous. Confronting him directly could backfire spectacularly. But the time for silence was over. Jane was done being the victim. She was done letting fear dictate her actions. She took a deep breath, steeling herself as she stood. Across the room, John sat in his office, the door slightly ajar. His laughter carried over the hum of the precinct, grating and smug. He had no idea what was coming. Clutching the envelope tightly, Jane started toward his office. Her steps were measured, deliberate. This wasn't just about her anymore. This was about every other officer who had endured similar torment, every voice that had been silenced. Tonight she wasn't walking into battle unarmed. She had her truth, her resolve, and the faint hope that justice could still prevail, even in the darkest corners of the precinct. As she reached the door, she paused, her hand hovering over the knob. The next few moments would determine everything. There was no turning back now. The weight of her secret was crushing. For years, Jane carried the burden of her HIV diagnosis in silence, a consequence of a traumatic incident during her rookie year. It had been an undercover operation gone disastrously wrong, a drug bust that spiraled into chaos. Amid the gunfire and shattered glass, Jane had been injured, her wound exposed to the blood of a suspect who later tested positive. The news had hit her like a freight train. At just 24, she was a rising star in the department, full of promise and ambition. Now, she was a rookie cop with a secret that could end her career before it even began. The stigma was too much to risk. Police culture wasn't kind to vulnerability, especially not this kind. So, Jane buried the truth deep, masking her fear with grit and determination. Every quarterly checkup, every pill, every moment of doubt had been hidden behind her badge. She worked harder than anyone else, solving cases that others wouldn't touch, earning accolades that she couldn't fully enjoy. But her success didn't shield her from the insidious prejudice she knew would surface if her condition ever became public. She was a fortress, strong on the outside but crumbling within. Tragic. Then came John. His harassment was unbearable, but his threats to dig into her personal life were what pushed her to the brink. She knew what he was capable of, and she couldn't let him uncover her truth. The thought of him wielding her diagnosis as a weapon against her filled her with dread. But something inside her shifted. Fear transformed into a cold, calculating rage. John had cornered her, but she refused to let him win. Jane's breaking point came late one night, alone in her apartment. She stared at her reflection in the mirror, her fists clenched. For years, she had been the department's go-to officer, the one everyone admired, and yet here she was, afraid, silenced, treated like prey. She was done. No more hiding, no more letting John dictate her life. The plan she devised was bold, dangerous, and utterly necessary. She would take matters into her own hands, not just for herself, but for every officer who had suffered in silence. But this wasn't just about exposing him. Jane needed to protect herself. She contacted a lawyer she trusted, leaving behind a sealed envelope labeled to be opened in case of my disappearance. It was her insurance policy, her final safeguard against John's reach. Then came the final piece of her plan, baiting John into making a mistake. She knew his ego was his greatest weakness. He thrived on control, on the power he held over others. So she crafted a situation where he would feel threatened, a way to force him into overstepping, exposing himself in a way that even his allies couldn't ignore. The precinct was eerily quiet that night. Jane had timed it perfectly. Most of the officers were out on calls, leaving her alone with John. She made her move, sending him a cryptic message. "We need to talk. Your office. Now." John found her waiting, standing in the middle of his office with a calmness that unnerved him. "What's this about, Officer Doe?" he sneered, his usual smugness on full display. Jane placed the envelope on his desk, her gaze steady. "It's about choices, Captain. Yours, specifically." His eyes narrowed as he opened the envelope, flipping through the documents inside. His face darkened, the smirk wiped clean. "You think this will scare me? You don't know who you're dealing with." "Oh, I know exactly who I'm dealing with," Jane said, her voice low and firm. "But I don't think you realize who you're dealing with. You've spent years trying to break me. But guess what, John? You failed." The tension in the room was electric. Jane leaned in, her voice a razor-sharp whisper. "Here's the deal. You resign quietly or this dossier goes public. Your choice." John's bravado faltered, replaced by the flicker of fear in his eyes. For the first time, Jane saw him for what he truly was, a coward hiding behind power. But Jane wasn't finished. "And one more thing," she said, her voice cutting through the silence. "If you ever come near me, or anyone else, with your games again, I'll make sure the entire city knows exactly what kind of man you are." She turned and walked out, leaving John alone with his crumbling empire. Jane Doe's world had long been a labyrinth of fear, resilience, and desperation. For years, she had endured relentless harassment from Captain John Smith, a man whose power was as unchecked as his cruelty. Every snide comment, every veiled threat, every unwanted advance added another layer to the suffocating weight pressing down on her. Jane had always been a fighter. As a young recruit, she excelled in every challenge thrown her way. Her ambition was fueled by an unshakable belief in justice and the power of the badge to protect those who couldn't protect themselves. But her dreams had collided with reality during her rookie year, when a traumatic incident left her with an HIV diagnosis, a secret she swore to take to her grave. The diagnosis was a cruel twist of fate, a silent adversary she had learned to live with. Jane's viral load was undetectable thanks to years of disciplined treatment, meaning the risk of transmission was virtually non-existent. But the stigma, the potential fallout if her secret became public, loomed over her like a storm cloud. When John's harassment escalated into outright threats, promising to destroy her career if she didn't comply, Jane felt trapped in a nightmare with no escape. Until one night, staring at her reflection in the bathroom mirror, a grim idea took root. What if she turned her burden into her weapon? It was an unthinkable thought born of desperation and rage. John's unchecked abuse had made her question everything she believed about the system she served. If the law wouldn't stop him, she would. The idea terrified her, but it also gave her a dangerous sense of power. For the first time in years, she felt in control. Jane spent weeks planning every detail. She researched legal nuances, her mind racing with the potential consequences. The risks were staggering: exposure, prosecution, the loss of her career and freedom. But the thought of another day under John's thumb was unbearable. It was a sweltering August night in Birmingham, Alabama, and the precinct was unusually quiet. Most officers had left for the night, leaving only a skeleton crew to man the phones. Jane was reviewing case files at her desk when she heard John's voice behind her. "Jane," he said, his tone dripping with false concern, "we need to have a talk. My office. Now." Her stomach churned, but she masked her unease with a practiced calm. She stood, nodding silently, and followed him down the dimly lit hallway. John's office was a suffocating space, cluttered with papers and the faint smell of stale coffee. He closed the door behind her, the lock clicking into place like the sound of a gun being cocked. "You've been distant lately," he said, leaning back in his chair, a predatory grin on his face. "That's not good for teamwork." Jane clenched her fists at her sides, forcing herself to remain composed. "I've had a lot on my plate," she said, her voice steady. He chuckled, the sound low and menacing. "Don't forget who's in charge here. I've been patient, but patience only goes so far." Her pulse thundered in her ears as she stepped closer, her movements deliberate. She played along, her every word and gesture designed to lull him into a false sense of control. When the moment came, she acted with cold precision, every action calculated. When she left his office that night, her expression was unreadable. Inside, she felt like she was teetering on the edge of an abyss. The days following the encounter were a whirlwind of conflicting emotions. Jane felt a grim satisfaction in knowing she had taken a stand, however unconventional. But guilt gnawed at her, a constant reminder of the line she had crossed. John, oblivious to her true intentions, became even more insufferable. He strutted around the precinct with newfound arrogance, convinced he had finally broken her. His smugness was like gasoline on the fire of Jane's anger, but she held her ground, determined to see her plan through. Weeks later, the first cracks in John's facade appeared. It started subtly. He seemed more irritable, his energy waning. Then, one morning, he collapsed in the middle of a briefing. Paramedics rushed him to the hospital, and the precinct was abuzz with speculation. When news of his hospitalization spread, whispers of misconduct began to surface. Officers who had turned a blind eye to John's behavior now found themselves under scrutiny. An internal investigation was launched, and Jane's name inevitably came up. She felt the walls closing in as detectives probed deeper into John's recent interactions. Every question they asked felt like a spotlight on her darkest secret. Alone in her apartment, Jane wrestled with the consequences of her actions. Her mind was a battlefield of guilt, fear, and defiance. She had acted out of desperation, but the weight of her choices was crushing. Her colleagues, once her friends, now regarded her with suspicion. The camaraderie she had once cherished was gone, replaced by an isolating sense of alienation. She questioned herself endlessly. Had she gone too far? Was she any better than John? The lines between victim and perpetrator blurred, leaving her in a moral no-man's land. As the investigation unfolded, the precinct became a pressure cooker of tension. The truth about John's predatory behavior came to light, tarnishing his once respected reputation. But Jane's role in the story was far more complicated. When her secret finally emerged, it sent shockwaves through the department. Some saw her as a hero, a survivor who fought back against an abusive system. Others viewed her as a villain, someone who had betrayed the very principles she swore to uphold. In the end, there were no easy answers. Jane's story forced everyone around her to confront uncomfortable truths about power, justice, and the human capacity for darkness. Her journey leaves us with a chilling question. When the system fails, how far is too far to take justice into your own hands?